Introducing Augmented Newtonian Dynamics, AND, and the Big Bang. From the very first moments after the Big Bang, the universe erupted with an overwhelming abundance of light. For every particle of matter that emerged, hundreds of trillions of photons were produced. Not as mere radiation, but as fundamental building blocks of interaction. According to the Augmented Newtonian Dynamics, AND, theory, these photons did not vanish. As the universe expanded and cooled, these photons lost energy and transitioned into a vast, pervasive sea of virtual photons, what we now identify as dark matter or the photon ether. This photon ether forms the invisible yet essential medium through which all electromagnetic energy propagates. Photons are the mediators of energy. Without them, no structures are possible. Real photons, emitted and absorbed by electrons, travel by aligning the virtual photons of the ether into transient, ordered paths. In this framework, structure arises not from abstract fields, but from the ceaseless exchange of real and virtual photons that allow particles to recognize and respond to one another. Thus, light was not merely a byproduct of the Big Bang. It was the blueprint of order, the silent architect of every atom, every interaction, and ultimately, of the entire cosmos. The photon ether emerges. As the universe expanded from the moment of the Big Bang, it produced an extraordinary flood of photons, far outnumbering matter. But these photons had nowhere to go. The universe was all there was. And there was no outside to escape to. Trapped within a finite yet growing space, they filled every part of it. Over time, as the universe expanded, these photons were stretched. Their energies dwindled. They transitioned from being real active photons into ultra-low-energy virtual photons. What remained was a vast, invisible sea of energy. A photon ether, permeating all of space. Not a remnant, but a dynamic medium. One that would go on to shape how light travels, how energy is exchanged, and even how gravity works. The story of light, according to Augmented Newtonian Dynamics. In the Augmented Newtonian Dynamics, and theory, the story of light begins with the electron. When an atom is excited, by heat, electromagnetic input, or another form of energy, its electrons react by emitting real photons. This process is distinctive and discrete but continuous. It's not a vague blur of wave functions as in QED. It is discrete, ordered, and physical. An excited electron emits a single, well-defined photon, but it emits these photons at the fantastic rate of hundreds of trillions per second. And when energy flow into the system is continuous, as in a heated object or a powered circuit, the electron is excited again. And again. And again. Each time, it emits another photon. Photon after photon, hundreds of trillions, yes trillions, not millions, of photons per second. Each identical to the preceding photon, each traveling in the same direction. This is a ray of light. These are not random emissions. They are identical, each with the same energy, the same frequency, the same direction. And each photon travels along a path formed by the alignment of virtual photons in the surrounding ether, a structure created by the act of emission itself. This is light in the Augmented Newtonian Dynamics and theory, not a continuous wave, but a stream of photons, each guided by a temporary, energyless alignment in the virtual photon field. Every photon begins its journey within an electron. In AND theory, photons are formed, emitted, and absorbed by electrons. They are not excitation of the quantum field as is stated by quantum mechanics. Every photon begins its journey within an electron. Electrons are not passive carriers of charge, they are dynamic systems that regulate their own energy. When an electron needs to release energy, to stabilize itself, it emits pulses of electrical energy. These pulses of energy form into a stable electric dipole configuration due to charge separation. This is a photon, a discrete packet of energy formed of electric tension and released into space. It is massless, electrically neutral, and always travels at the speed of light. It is a stable structure that can maintain its energy intact over limitless distances. But the photon doesn't simply fly off into emptiness. It travels by aligning the virtual photons already present, turning the ether into its path. At the same time, virtual photons that come into contact with this line of photons are promoted to real photons through a transfer of energy. This process explains how light obeys the inverse square law and at the same time preserves its original energy and is rectilinear. Quantum electrodynamics, QED, and quantum field theory, QFT. Quantum field theory begins elegantly. Photons and electrons are just ripples in invisible fields. But as soon as we deal with real atoms, especially ones with many electrons, the theory switches tracks. Instead of fields in space, we now describe everything using a single wave function that lives in a space with dozens, or even hundreds and thousands, of dimensions. The problem? Our universe only has 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time. These extra dimensions proposed by QFT and QED aren't physical. We can't see them, measure them, or even explain what they are. They're just part of the math. Maybe it's time we asked, are we explaining the world, or just describing it with increasingly abstract tools? Shouldn't we question a theory that relies on dimensions no one can even define? In quantum mechanics, electrons are treated as elusive entities, sometimes particles, sometimes waves, never fully either. They appear as point particles in scattering experiments, yet their wave functions describe them as smeared-out clouds of probability around nuclei. This ambiguity has led to persistent conceptual confusion. Is the electron a real thing, or just a mathematical convenience? Wave-particle duality, a centuries-old dilemma. Wave-particle duality was a bold concept proposed long before we had the means to test it. Even today, we lack the resolution to directly observe particles like electrons or protons. At such scales, the theory remains unproven, more a reflection of our limitations than a confirmed truth. It filled a gap in our understanding, but may have done so with assumptions we can now begin to question. In the end theory, this ambiguity is removed. The electron is treated as a real, dynamic system, not a point particle and not a probability wave. It is an energy-stable, self-regulating system that maintains its integrity by continuously emitting and reabsorbing photons. This emission isn't random. It follows a pattern that reflects the electron's internal energy state and interactions with its surroundings. Atomic stability in AND theory arises not from wave-particle duality but from a continuous, self-regulating exchange of virtual photons. Just as the nucleus maintains its integrity through ongoing interactions among its constituent particles, the electron remains stably bound to the atom by constantly emitting and absorbing virtual photons. These self-interactions, drawn from the virtual photon ether, result in maintaining the electron's energy and position without resorting to probabilistic wave functions. This dynamic, mechanical process replaces the abstract notion of an electron existing everywhere at once with a clear physical mechanism of continuous interaction, restoring realism to atomic structure and eliminating the need for duality. In AND theory, the Z-Man effect, which refers to the splitting of spectral lines into multiple components when a magnetic field alters the electron's pattern of virtual photon self-interaction. And the Hall effect, long considered puzzling or requiring abstract postulates in quantum mechanics, are naturally and physically explained through the continuous self-interaction of electrons via virtual photons. Rather than invoking uncertain spin states or orbital quantization, AND theory posits that each electron constantly emits and absorbs virtual photons to maintain its energy equilibrium. In the presence of a magnetic field, this process becomes directionally biased, creating measurable shifts in energy levels, as observed in the Z-Man effect. Similarly, in the Hall effect, the lateral force on electrons arises from the interaction between their photon-mediated trajectories and the external magnetic field, not from a vague Lorentz force but from actual realignment of virtual photon paths. This same mechanism of self-regulation leads to a stable, layered structure of electrons around the nucleus. In AND theory, atomic structure arises not from abstract rules or probabilistic distributions, but from the continuous, purposeful behavior of electrons seeking to maintain their energy balance through the emission and absorption of virtual photons. Each electron responds to its local energy environment by adjusting its position, establishing stable patterns that form orbitals, not as vague clouds, but as real zones shaped by photon-mediated interactions. The Aufbau principle, instead of being an empirical shortcut, becomes a logical outcome of this behavior. Electrons occupy orbitals in an orderly fashion because the density of existing virtual photon lines and their directional alignment only allow specific regions to support new arrivals. Pauli exclusion is no longer a statistical prohibition but a physical incompatibility of field configurations. Electrons do not randomly jump between levels, they move deliberately, finding equilibrium within a dynamic lattice of virtual photon exchanges. As a result, atomic stability, electron shell structure, and even periodicity emerge from mechanical causation, not wave function abstraction. The atom, once reduced to mathematical shadows, regains substance as a system of balanced, ongoing electromagnetic self-regulation. Atomic structure arises from electrons maintaining energy balance through the continuous emission and absorption of virtual photons, each in a precise, ordered sequence. Orbitals form as stable pathways where two electrons emit photons in an interleaved, synchronized rhythm. A third electron cannot enter the same orbital, not because of an abstract exclusion principle, but because its photon emission would result in resonance and clash with the established rhythm. This would destabilize the finely tuned energy exchange. Therefore, the two-electron limit emerges from real physical constraints: density, directional compatibility, and the temporal order of emissions. The Aufbau principle follows from these mechanics. Electrons fill orbitals in a cascade of stable, rhythmic photon interactions. The atom becomes a structure of active electromagnetic regulation, grounded in causality, not chance or supposition. The periodic table, classically divided into S, P, D, and F blocks, finds a far more intuitive and physically grounded explanation under AND theory. Here, the focus shifts from imaginary orbital shapes to the actual energy and speed of the electron. Electrons are fast-moving particles constantly emitting and absorbing photons to stabilize their energy. The S, P, D, and F blocks emerge naturally from this process, as each block represents a distinct level of complexity in the electron's emission rhythm. The S block allows just two electrons, each occupying a unique emission sequence without interference. As atoms grow heavier, electrons must adjust by entering higher speed, higher energy paths, producing increasingly intricate but ordered sequences, the origin of the P, D, and F structures. Unlike quantum mechanics, which relies on abstract wave functions and invisible dimensions, and theory explains the periodic table in terms of real, observable dynamics, electron speed, photon interaction, and the fundamental drive to maintain energy balance. In AND theory, there are only four distinct types of stable emission patterns available to electrons, corresponding to the S, P, D, and F blocks. These aren't arbitrary labels but real, physical sequences of increasing complexity and energy. Even for heavy elements like uranium, all electrons still fall into one of these four categories. The complexity of the atom doesn't arise from the invention of new types of orbitals, but from the repetition and nesting of these existing patterns at higher energy levels. As electrons are added to larger atoms, they fill the same types of sequences S, P, D, or F, but at greater distances from the nucleus and at much higher speeds and energy states. For example, uranium, with 92 electrons, fills multiple S, P, D, and F layers, including the deep-lying 5F orbitals. These are not new shapes but reiterations of the same emission structures, operating at more extreme parameters. So AND theory accommodates heavy elements without the need to multiply dimensions or orbital types. It simply recognizes that electrons re-enter the same rhythmic patterns at higher levels, always guided by their energy and the need to avoid resonance. Gravity in AND theory, tensioned alignments of virtual photons. In AND theory, gravity is not a separate force, it is the subtle consequence of the electron's own need to stay balanced. Each electron constantly emits and reabsorbs virtual photons, hundreds of trillions of times every second, and unlike the emission of real photons that are highly directional, virtual photons are emitted isotropically, in every direction. These emissions cause brief alignments in the surrounding virtual photon ether, forming fleeting paths that vanish almost instantly, yet reappear again and again without pause. When two bodies are near each other, the fields of their self-stabilizing electrons begin to overlap. Where this happens, those transient alignments lock into place, forming invisible tension lines, direct, energy-efficient paths between the two objects. This web of connections is unimaginably delicate, each line 100 trillion times weaker than the electromagnetic force, but their number and persistence give rise to a familiar phenomenon, gravity. This explanation fits all the known properties of gravity. It is by far the weakest of the four fundamental forces, yet it never stops. It acts on all matter, everywhere, and always pulls, never pushes. It follows the inverse square law. Its strength diminishes with distance, but never truly vanishes. And it is not determined simply by the mass or size of an object, but by its density, the number and closeness of electrons that are constantly interacting with the ether. In a time when science was still in its infancy with no technology to speak of, Newton made the observation that the force of gravity, the cause of which he was unable to fully ascertain, arose from the center of bodies, in other words from atoms themselves. In A&D theory, this is no longer mere speculation. Gravity is not something imposed on matter from outside. It is the continuous, cumulative rhythm of electrons exchanging energy with the fabric of the universe itself. In the A&D theory of gravity, there is no need to bend space, curve time, or search for elusive gravitons. In A&D theory, gravity emerges naturally from the ceaseless effort of electrons to stabilize themselves through virtual photon exchange. It is not a force imposed from without, nor a warping of a mathematical framework, but a real physical interaction rooted in the structure of matter itself. No metaphors, no extra dimensions, just electrons, energy, and the invisible threads of the ether they stimulate into alignment. Simple, elegant, and consistent with what gravity has always shown us: weak, constant, universal, and relentless. It is the ultimate connection between matter and space. Conclusion: rethinking the foundation. Modern physics has long offered uncertainty where we needed clarity: waves that aren't real, particles without paths, and forces that emerge from fields we cannot see. And theory offers a different approach. It starts with one postulate: the electron maintains its energy by emitting and absorbing photons in a constant, structured process. These photons move through a universal medium formed at the Big Bang, a sea of virtual photons that fills the universe. This is not speculation, it is what we now call dark matter. Light travels by aligning this medium. Gravity arises from tension across it. There is no need for curved spacetime, probabilistic wave functions, or imaginary dimensions. Every interaction, electromagnetic, gravitational, atomic, can be explained by energy regulation at the level of the electron. No mysteries. No paradoxes. Only connection, cause, and consequence. And theory answers, yes.